Researcher Constance Aron spent years tracking divorced couples and found something almost nobody expects. Out of every divorced parent she studied, only a small handful, the ones she literally labeled perfect pals, stayed close enough to still call each other regularly, years later, just to talk. Most couples, she found, either went completely cold or stayed locked in low-grade conflict forever. The perfect pals were the rare exception. And if you're a Gen X man who still picks up the phone when your ex-wife calls, still talks for 10 minutes about nothing urgent, still doesn't flinch when her name shows up on the screen, you're one of the rare ones. The question is whether you actually know why. I'm Gray, and today we're getting into something almost nobody explains properly: the Gen X man who still calls his ex-wife regularly, years after the divorce, and isn't secretly pining for her, isn't using the kids as an excuse, and isn't doing anything wrong. Give me a few minutes on this one, because the reason it happens is more specific than they never really got over each other, and once you see the actual mechanism, you'll understand exactly why this pattern shows up so often in men your age specifically. Your phone buzzes on a Tuesday afternoon, and the name that comes up is a woman you divorced 14 years ago. You answer without hesitating, without checking who's around, without any of the awkwardness people assume should be there. You talk for 6 minutes about nothing urgent, a shared kid's car trouble, a mutual friend's surgery, whether the storm is supposed to hit her side of town too. Then you hang up and go back to whatever you were doing. Nobody in your house thinks anything of it. There was no fight in that call. There didn't need to be one. Here's the first piece, the part researchers actually put numbers on. A study published in the Journal of Divorce and Remarriage, led by researcher Kira Burdett alongside colleagues from the University of Michigan and Istanbul's Özyeğin University, looked at 54 formerly married couples still raising kids together. What they found cuts directly against the assumption most people carry into this topic. Couples who maintained some ongoing personal, emotional connection after divorce, not romance, just connection, rated their co-parenting relationship as noticeably higher quality than couples who cut contact down to logistics only. Staying somewhat close wasn't a sign the divorce failed to take. It was, statistically, a sign the working relationship afterward was healthier than most people's. Here's the detail inside that same study that should really catch your attention. The effect was asymmetric. When men reported staying personally involved with their ex-wives, the ex-wives reported significantly better co-parenting experiences. The reverse relationship, women staying involved improving how the men experienced co-parenting, wasn't found in the data. Sit with that for a second, because it flips the usual story on its head. The stereotype says women are the ones who keep relationships alive after they officially end. This particular study says something different. When the man was the one staying reachable, present, and personally engaged, the co-parenting arrangement functioned better, according to the woman living inside it. Think about why that might actually make sense once you sit with it. A lot of men your age were taught that divorce means departure. You handled the settlement, you handled the custody schedule, and once the paperwork cleared, the emotional account was supposed to close along with it. Staying warm with an ex-wife past that point felt, to a lot of men, like some kind of failure to properly exit. But raising children together doesn't actually end when the marriage does. It just changes shape. And the fathers who understood that distinction early, who kept answering the phone, kept showing up personally instead of only administratively, ended up running a smoother second act than the ones who tried to seal the whole relationship shut the day the divorce was finalized. There's a specific reason this lands harder on men of your generation than it might on younger divorced fathers. You were raised on a very binary model of relationships, married or not married, together or apart, and very little vocabulary for anything living in the space between those two categories. Younger generations grew up watching co-parenting arrangements get discussed openly, watched blended families get normalized on television and social media, watched friends model amicable divorces as a legitimate option rather than a failure state. You didn't get that vocabulary handed to you early. You had to invent the category yourself, quietly, without anyone telling you it was allowed, which is probably why so many men your age describe these calls almost apologetically, like they're confessing to something slightly irregular instead of simply describing a working arrangement. Here's what's underneath that, the part that explains why the pattern is actually so rare. Arons, the same researcher who coined the term perfect pals, identified several distinct categories divorced couples tend to fall into. Some become what she called fiery foes, locked in permanent conflict for years. Some become dissolved duos, where one parent essentially disappears and contact fades to nothing. A smaller group manage to become cooperative colleagues, civil and functional without much warmth. And then there's the smallest group of all, the perfect pals, who stay genuinely close. Being in that last, rarest category isn't the default outcome of a good divorce. It's the result of two specific people choosing, repeatedly, over years, to keep the connection alive on purpose, long after the legal requirement to speak to each other ever really ended. Here's the turn that surprises people the most. This isn't primarily about the kids, even though the kids are usually the reason the phone number never got deleted in the first place. Psychologist Carl Pickhardt, who's written extensively about post-divorce family dynamics, describes something he calls remarrying as parents, the idea that even after a marriage legally ends, two people can consciously choose to maintain a working alliance specifically built around raising children well. That alliance requires actual maintenance. It requires the same basic ingredients any relationship needs to stay functional: responsiveness, reasonableness, a willingness to pick up the phone instead of letting things curdle into silence. A lot of men who kept calling their ex-wives weren't failing to move on. They were quietly doing the harder, less celebrated work of keeping that specific alliance alive on purpose. There's a further piece of this worth naming honestly, because it explains why the alliance sometimes outlives its original purpose without anyone noticing. The kids grow up. They stop needing custody schedules coordinated, stop needing two households synchronized on medical appointments and school events. And yet the calls sometimes keep happening anyway, past the point where logistics strictly require them, because somewhere along the way the relationship quietly became its own thing again, smaller, different, but real, independent of whatever originally justified it. Nobody sits down and decides this on purpose. It just becomes true gradually, the same way most long-term patterns do. There's a specific moment worth sitting with here, one a lot of men in this position eventually notice if they think about it honestly. You call her about something small, a school form, a medical bill split between two households, and the conversation runs a little longer than it strictly needed to. She mentions something about her week. You mentioned something about yours. For a few minutes, you're just two people who know each other extremely well, catching up, the way old friends do. And afterward, some part of you feels slightly guilty about how easy that felt, like enjoying the conversation is somehow evidence you're not fully divorced from her, when really it's evidence of something else entirely, that you built something functional out of the wreckage instead of just abandoning the site. Here's the part almost nobody says, the twist most people never consider. There's a specific, documented category of divorced people who report speaking to their ex-spouse nearly every day, years after the split, and describe genuinely trusting that person's advice and insight more than almost anyone else's, not out of unresolved romantic feeling, but because 18 or 20 years of marriage builds a kind of specialized knowledge about a person that doesn't simply evaporate the moment the relationship changes category. She still knows exactly which version of your explanation you're leaving out. You still know exactly when her calm voice on the phone means she's actually furious about something. That fluency doesn't disappear on the day of the divorce. For some men, throwing it away entirely feels like discarding something genuinely useful, not clinging to something painful. A lot of men in this position will tell you, if you push past the first defensive answer, that the calls aren't emotionally complicated most of the time. They're not longing for reconciliation. They're closer to checking in with someone who happens to know an enormous amount about your actual life, your kids, your extended family, your medical history, your embarrassing habits, because she was there, present, for a huge stretch of the years that built you into who you currently are. Cutting that off completely wouldn't make you more moved on. It would just make you less known by anyone. Here's something most men won't admit out loud about this. Some men privately worry that admitting they still talk regularly with an ex-wife will sound, to a new partner, like evidence of unfinished business. That fear is exactly why a lot of these calls happen quietly, almost secretively, not because anything shameful is happening on the call itself, but because explaining the relationship's actual texture, friendly, functional, occasionally warm, entirely non-romantic, takes more nuance than most casual conversations allow for. It's easier to just not mention it than to explain something that sounds more complicated out loud than it actually feels while you're living it. There's a further complication worth being honest about, one that shows up specifically when a man remarries or starts a serious new relationship. A new partner walking into this dynamic has no history with the ex-wife, no felt sense of why the calls exist or what they actually sound like, and reasonably want some clarity about where the boundaries sit. The men who handle this best tend to be transparent early, explaining the shape of the arrangement before it becomes a mystery the new partner has to investigate on her own. The men who handle it worst tend to minimize or hide the calls, which almost always backfires, because a hidden ordinary thing looks far more suspicious than an openly acknowledged one, even when the content of the calls never changes at all. Here's where the stakes actually rise, because this pattern isn't universally healthy just because it can be healthy. There's a real difference between the man whose calls with his ex-wife function as a stable, mutually respectful parenting alliance, and the man whose calls are really just a socially acceptable disguise for feelings he never processed, using the kids as the official cover story for contact he'd be seeking anyway. Both versions look identical from the outside, same phone calls, same friendly tone, same frequency. Only the man on the inside of it actually knows which category his calls fall into, and a lot of men have never honestly asked themselves the question. This is the honest turning point, the one worth sitting with the longest. The real risk was never simply staying in contact with an ex-wife. The research on couples like the perfect pals suggests that ongoing, respectful contact tends to produce a steadier, less stressful co-parenting arrangement for both adults involved. The real risk is not checking in with yourself about what the contact is actually doing for you emotionally, and letting a genuinely healthy arrangement drift, without you noticing, into something that's quietly interfering with your current relationship or keeping you tethered to a chapter you've told everyone, including yourself, that you've already closed. Here's what tends to actually clarify this, and it's simpler than people expect. Ask yourself honestly what the call would feel like if it had nothing to do with the kids at all, no shared child, no shared logistics, nothing practical binding you together anymore. If the answer is that you'd probably still want to talk to her sometimes, that's not automatically a problem, but it's information worth being honest with yourself about, especially if you're currently building a life with someone else who deserves to know the real shape of that old connection, not a version edited down to sound simpler than it is. There's one more angle worth considering before wrapping this up, and it has to do with how your own kids are watching all of this, whether you realize it or not. Kids who grow up seeing their parents handle each other with basic decency tend to carry a different template into their own adult relationships than kids who watch two people treat each other as permanent enemies long after the marriage ended. You're not just managing a phone call. You're quietly demonstrating, every time you pick up, what it looks like to disagree with someone completely, build separate lives, and still choose basic respect over permanent hostility. That's not a small thing to be modeling, even if nobody in the house ever says it out loud. The uncomfortable truth underneath all of this is that a divorce ends a marriage, not necessarily a relationship, and pretending those are the same thing is where a lot of confusion quietly creeps in. Some men keep calling their ex-wives because doing so genuinely serves the co-parenting alliance and costs them nothing real. Others keep calling because some part of the old bond never got a proper, honest goodbye, and the ongoing contact is doing double duty as both co-parenting and unfinished business. Only you know, if you're honest, which category your calls actually belong to. The good news, if there is one, is that this doesn't require ending anything that's actually working. It requires one honest look at what those calls are doing for you, asked privately, away from any conversation with her at all, so that whatever you decide to keep, you're keeping on purpose instead of by inertia. I'm Gray, and this is the Quiet Sixties, where we talk about the things men in their 60s actually think about, but rarely say out loud. If you're still on good terms with an ex, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments what those calls actually feel like now, all these years later. And if you're new here, subscribe, because next time we're getting into something almost nobody in this generation says plainly, and you're going to want to see it.